Hi, welcome to the artist lecture for the second part of Set 6. 2.19 or 2.20 are fantasy in 1 or 2-point perspective. You'll just choose one, not both. So you'll be adding fantastical elements, which some of my students laughed at me for the word fantastical elements, but you're going to add fantasy-based elements within 1 or 2-point perspective. You may create a spooky Halloween town. You may have monsters invading the city, all sorts of stuff, and I am excited to see what you pull out. What I want you to focus on is trying to get used to perspective. Now, I'm not going to be super strict on the perspective lines, but you should have objects placed in the background and foreground of your image to give the illusion of you've placed things in perspective. Now, if you may have taken drawing or classes in school where you've had to do perspective. So you've had to draw the lines, and it's usually like a hallway or room or an outside street, and you had to line everything up to show that things that are further away seem smaller. And to think about perspective, it is a graphic device that allows artists to create the illusion of depth on a flat two-dimensional surface. Now, we want things to appear 3D, and we're working with flat objects, and with digital might even be more of a challenge we'll get to later. So you need to understand there's a horizon line and a vanishing point. Now, 1-point perspective, as you can see in this image, we have the horizon line, which is typically where the sky and the land would meet. This isn't always the case, but it is about 90% of the time, and it vanishes off to a single point, vanishes, and everything aligns to it. And as you can see, this aligns them. Now, in real life, these real boards are probably the same width apart, but because they appear further away, they appear smaller and they vanish off to a single point. Images that show good perspective have these strong lined elements. You need to give us that clue. Well, an image may be in 1 or 2-point perspective, but if it doesn't have those lines, it's going to be difficult for you to use. So 1-point perspective is a drawing method that shows how things get smaller as they get further away, converging towards a single vanishing point on the horizon line. It's a great way of drawing objects upon a flat sheet of paper that gives the look of 3D and realistic depth. So drawing in 1-point perspective is usually appropriate when the subject's viewed front on, such as looking directly at the face of a cube or a wall or etc. Or when looking at something down a long road, track, pathway. So they see the symbol, and the simplicity of it is you have a vanishing point and a horizon line, and if we're to draw a shape, the corners, if you take a ruler, would line up. Very convenient. So when you're working with the horizon line, objects that are above it appear looking up at them. You see the bottom of the object. Objects that are drawn at the line, you see, well, if they're below the line, you look down. And that you kind of see it face on. You don't really see the top or bottom. So if you're looking up, you see the bottom. If you're looking down, you see the top. If you're looking out of it, you see nor the top or bottom. This image helps clarify that. This is an example of a drawing with a vanishing point. A very highly detailed drawing. You can see some of these pencil marks that the artist used. So it's a lot of lining things up with pencils. So if you've taken a drawing class, you may have done this before. And this is an excellent image to sort of base something off of. You've got these strong lines, and you can measure your perspective. So if this figure was further down, we know that they are kind of roughly a little bit above, their head would be a little bit above this line. So if it was further down, their height is still the same, but they appear smaller and their head would just be a little bit above this line here. And that's a good way to measure things, or maybe they take a little, about half of this street pole. So it's a good way to measure people as you push them further away. Here is a street using 1-point perspective. Now you can use Photoshop or Illustrator. I highly recommend using Photoshop and finding images off the internet that have these strong vanishing points first, then adding your elements. It can be very time consuming to draw everything straight through in Illustrator. You're more than welcome to do that. Personally, I'm not super comfortable with the perspective tool in Illustrator. I've taught the Classroom Notebook series, and it was very frustrating. And it's not my friend, I will be the first to admit, and I prefer working within Photoshop using images. See, another street scene. This one's great because it's got sort of the trolley lines, which help lead us out. And these guides really help us when we think about vanishing points. Everything's vanishing off to a point and adding some fantastical elements. It is sort of the obvious, easiest thing to like make something underwater, which I encourage you not to do because I think that's obvious and easy. It's an easy thing, just make it underwater, give it kind of this nice blue haze. It might be fun to practice with, but I don't want to see it for the final one because I've seen it so much. So another idea for 1-point perspective is things that are interior, like subway cars. So if you follow these lines to a vanishing point, what's really cool about this is you can think about, what do people do in subway cars? They sit, they relax, they talk to their friends. Sometimes there's people who perform in a subway car. But maybe you can add an extra element. So what would make it have that fantasy element? Maybe it's all your favorite superheroes in a fantasy car together, in a subway car for the fantasy element. Maybe there's monsters taking over. Maybe it's a robot world and robots are going to work but they take the subway because they have to rest their robotic legs or something like that. So you can really think of really fun, obscure, great ideas to go with this. So even flipping things up is always a fun element to play with. So something like this would be a little bit more difficult because the trees aren't really giving us strong lines. Now this is 1-point perspective. But without those strong lines, it's a little bit more difficult for us to measure. So something like this, I would rather you not do because it's going to add that level of challenge. But if you're up to it, maybe that'll be something for you. This vanishing point's kind of up here. This is kind of more 3-point perspective. So these steps get smaller as they go up. Now this is kind of wonky because we were really shifting the elements here. So that subway car again with water and underwater, which again, I see a lot of, but you think of the This kind of seems like a weird dream, and maybe you illustrate your dreams and they have some fun fantasy elements. So this one's a little different, but those photographers, see the perspective done here and scaled down. Knowing your free transform and pivot point, and those would definitely help you with your scaling. Kind of like a photo montage of a room with the Golden Gate Bridge. So what might really help is drawing a new layer and putting your points on. So kind of like the guides we set up for the mandala, you guys can do for 1 or 2 point perspective. So taking a new layer, putting guides down, measuring things could really help as you're working to measure your objects. And you can hide this layer later. 2 point perspective is a similar process, but it has 2 vanishing points on one horizon line. So this is kind of like corners of streets, and you have worm's eye view and bird's eye view. So worm's eye, if you're a worm, you look up and you see the bottom of something. If you look down, you see the top of something, you're a bird. And street level is where we see neither the top or bottom. And you kind of have this middle point where it can shift at any point, but the vanishing points will stay the same. So 2 points, you need to space them out for on the horizon line for 2 point perspective. They don't need to be on the picture plane, just as long as they're on a single horizon line. A good thing is to think about corners. These would be corners of buildings. Usually that's what it's for. So you can see vanishing points insert that center axis is the corner where things meet, but these lines still continue on. So if you're building a complicated street scene, this might be something of interest. So again, if something is above the top of if it's something above, you see the bottom, worm. It's on the bottom, you see the top, bird. You can see it in practice here. Bedroom interiors can be a little difficult. But they can be possible. Game board pieces are always really fun, just aligning everything up. Now this is a student project, so nothing's aligned quite perfect, but this could be something of interest. Again, finding an image with strong lines like the corner of a building, and then working off that could be a great start. Maybe you can turn this into like a picture of a haunted house, have cobwebs, make it spooky. MC Escher works a lot with perspective, and his is very skewed. Just an example of an illustration. So for my illustrators in the class, people who like to draw and illustrate, this is going to be a really fun assignment for you. I definitely, in my in-person class, I was telling them not to take too much time on it because you can get very sucked into all the tiny details. So maybe you mix some hand-drawn elements with a photograph to save yourself time, and then you can work on really perfecting it very nicely. So dealing a lot with the bird's eye view here. So in addition to talking 1 or 2 point perspective, we're going to talk about atmospheric and aerial perspective. These are elements you can add to your 1 or 2 point perspective. You should not do an atmospheric, fantasy and atmospheric perspective. It's not the studio actions, but putting these within your studio actions would make you a stronger artist. So we're lucky we live in the desert and we're in the valley, and we see mountains every day, and they're further away, they're a little hazy. An atmospheric or aerial perspective is the effect we get when faraway objects take on the colors of atmospheric haze. So the object's saturation decreases with the distance, so further away is less saturated it is. But distant objects' colors blend and take on the color of the atmosphere. So they lose a lot of their color saturation and take on the atmospheric saturation. Typically you see a little bit of a haze. The contrast will decrease with distance. Decreased saturation and contrast explain why it's harder to see or resolve the fine details. So that's why you may not see many of the peaks and valleys of all the mountains, but you kind of see them through. Low contrast means there isn't much difference between the brightness and darkest areas, but it doesn't mean it's blurred. It just has a soft haze. However, brightness increases. So this is where everyone gets tripped up. So it appears brighter and not darker when it's further away. So the edges will remain sharp when far away, but the fine details are lost. Now for you to really understand this, maybe take a look on some of the mountains and take some photographs to kind of compare and contrast. So here's an image. We have what's close to us and then what's further away from us. And we see those nice edges, but those fine details are lost. The saturation is decreased, but it appears brighter than the image in the foreground. Another example, saturation decreases with distance. But contrast will decrease, but land brightness increases. Another example. So these are not 1 or 2 point perspective per se, but these are things you may pull in to your information. Again, there's not the strong lines, but something that's further away, you can make it appear as well. Now this is a very flat illustration, but it does illustrate atmospheric perspective. Sort of 1 point perspective and using atmospheric perspective. Another example. So student work, this is where you're going to get your ideas. Remember, we're adding fantasy elements and 1 and 2 point perspective. So this student found an illustration of a train or an image of a train. They used it to copy and illustrate. And they have these sort of fantastical monsters. Now, we don't know what size they are. There are things out of this world. So the scale of them is a little more difficult because something over here, I don't know how big it is in real life, but putting objects in the back that appear smaller give the illusion of perspective, and that's something you need to work on. The train appears smaller, and we have little objects in the back. Now since they put objects or parts in front and back, it made it a very strong, striking image. This is using 2 point perspective within an interior of a room, which is, again, I said, very difficult. But thinking where things line up and adding sort of these realistic sort of marble glass elements to it. So this one is a good example of how you need to measure things. Now these little jellyfish, they're out of this world, so we don't have a relation for their height. I think the student mentioned these were sort of like glass jellyfish sculptures. So, but we're going to take in consideration on sizing it to what's nearby. So we have this little creature here, and this is probably about 5'11", maybe 6 foot, and it is about 1 1/3 times bigger. So measuring around the size of people, the next one should be around 1 1/3 times bigger over here, and the ones back there. So using clues within your scene to help you measure things will help you use perspective. This student used 1-point perspective, really meta, thinking about the internet, using some memes and in parts of the project. Using a setup card can be difficult, but it can be very fun. This one was nice because it added drawn elements and illustrated elements and real photographs. So sort of thinking that blend could be a nice fantasy element. Now this student didn't have too much push in the back, but thinking about how to place things in perspective in this sort of underwater world. Another underwater one, so I don't want to see it again. But think about these fun elements you can add and placing things that appear smaller as they are further away. So if you have fun with this, I really want you to think about how you can really add these fantasy elements. Find a really strong image first. I think that's probably what I would do. Go to Creative Commons, Flickr, try to find some image with really strong lines. Maybe it is a streetcar, train interior. Maybe it is a street that I turned in some sort of ghost town full of robots or something. But there's so many fun elements you can have. A lot of students, I know in the past, that have created characters or do a lot of writing, use this to illustrate. I will be sending you guys a message on Thursday just asking where you're at, trying to see if I can help you further your project along individually. So keep a lookout for that. If you have any questions or inspiration, email me, because I'll get to that a lot quicker than I do with comments on Canvas. If you email me through Canvas or send me a message through Canvas Messenger that is, I get it on my phone and I contact it very similarly. So I hope this, Benny says hi, he wants to know how you guys are doing. I hope this kind of helps you think about perspective. Look at, he just wants to be part of this class so bad. Look at the demos. There's some great videos on the internet that I found to help kind of frame the details as well as the PDFs. So if you have any questions, you can just contact me directly, and I will send everyone an individual message just to see where you're at, where your ideas are, and see if I can help you then. So I hope you have a great day thinking about perspective and fantastical elements.